So we're diving into day 4, 5, and 6 of creation. Last week we looked at the first 3 days, and now we're going to look at the next 3 days. And there's a fascinating pattern that I want to show you in the way that creation was formed on this first page. And as we look, we're continuing along the theme of seeing God's word in action and what he actually does and how he fills his creation and kind of the initial purpose of creation before humans even come on the scene. I'm excited to dive in. So grab your pencils, get your PDF, and let's go. Genesis 1:14 through 25. God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will mark events, sacred seasons, days, and years. They will be lights in the dome of the sky to shine on the earth." And that's what happened. God made the stars and 2 great lights, the larger light to rule over the day and the smaller light to rule over the night. God put them in the dome of the sky to shine on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. God saw how good it was. There was evening and there was morning, the 4th day. God said, "Let the waters swarm with living things, and let the birds fly above the earth up in the dome of the sky." God created the great sea animals and all the tiny things, living things that swarm in the waters, each according to its kind, and all the winged birds, each according to its kind. And God saw how good it was. Then God blessed them. "Be fertile and multiply and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." There was evening and there was morning, the 5th day. God said, "Let the earth produce every kind of living thing, livestock, crawling things, and wildlife." And that's what happened. God made every kind of wildlife, every kind of livestock, and every kind of creature that crawls on the ground. God saw how good it was. Okay, so I kind of mentioned this in the introduction, but it's helpful to maybe see it visually. God creates creation on page 1 with a pattern. There's kind of day 1, day 2, and day 3, which we looked at last week. And those kind of create the stage, the light from dark, the waters from the waters, and the land. And then he fills them in the next pattern of 3. So day 4, 5, and 6 fills their corresponding day from page 1. That's just a helpful kind of to see the pattern going on here, I find really helpful. And so in day 4, he creates the actual lights. In day 5, you can see he's creating the things that live in the waters. On day 3, he's creating the things that live on the land. And we haven't even finished day 6 because next week we're going to look at the crowning achievement of day 6, which is humanity itself. So what else could we say? What are some repetitions that are going on here, or key words? Some of the key words that jump out to me are what these different creations are actually doing in God's creation. And so he's making the stars, and he says he made the stars to rule over the day. It's kind of an interesting turn of phrase that he's creating the lights in the sky rule over the day. What's going on there? And then as we saw this just kind of jumped out at me, partly because it's foreshadowing, but to be fertile and multiply, to fill the waters in the seas, to let the birds multiply on the earth. We saw this, I have last week's text really quick, but we also saw this here. God is creating, but it's not a static creation. As God creates, he's giving his creations the ability to do something in creation. The lights are ruling. Here the plants are, they're bearing fruit according to its own kind. So now they are also somehow given the ability to create after themselves. They're not just static. It's not like a child creating a Play-Doh structure, and those Play-Doh structures can't do anything but sit there. They actually can create. The trees are producing after their own kind. The animals are being fruitful and multiplying across the earth. The stars are ruling over the sky. We'll get to that in just a little bit. What else? What other key repetitions? There's more. We saw this last week, but God's speaking. God is saying and naming things throughout. God is speaking things into existence. God said, "Let the waters swarm." God said, "Let the earth produce." And all of this, God said, God said. The other repetition, same as last week, is God saw. God is observing his creation and seeing how good it was. I like that. We didn't really touch on that as much last week, but the repetition of the goodness of creation really shines through here. And there's so much more that we could talk about. One, and this just kind of sets up the conversation for next week, but I'm really still just fascinating. These are some key words that pay attention, because when God creates humanity in God's image, the word rule is going to show up. This idea of being fruitful and multiply is going to show up. And back from last week, this idea of producing according to its kind is going to show up. And so already on page 1, we see that creation itself is somehow mimicking what humanity is going to do. I think sometimes we tend to think of ourselves as too separate from creation. But look at this. There's something about the stars and the planets, or the plants and the animals, that are already doing what humanity does as a crowning achievement. The creation itself is already doing. I think there's something to that. One, maybe because this is kind of confusing, we don't often think about the stars in the sky, maybe a little more depth in that. The stars were set up to mark the sacred seasons, days, and years. This is like a worship type image. And as we read on further into the Jewish texts, especially books like Leviticus, the stars, the sun, the moon were used primarily to mark the seasons of worship, of which calendar dates do we worship God and which festivals do we hold. And so this was God putting into the fabric of creation markers for how people were supposed to worship God. And so that's at least one element of what's going on here. Why does he create sacred seasons, days, and years with the lights in the sky? It's a way to call his people to worship him. So let's take a moment to reflect on what all this could mean for us. Well, for me, the fact alone that the creation itself has already been paralleling, mimicking, foreshadowing the role that humans will play on the next passage. We haven't even gotten to the humans being created to rule and multiply in the world yet. But already we've seen the trees creating after their own kind, the stars ruling in the skies, and the animals multiplying and filling the earth. A lot of the same key words that are about to be used of humans were already used of God's creation. To me, it gives me that sense of the grandness of creation and my small part in all of that. There's something big going on beyond all of us. And that's a good thing to reflect, because too much of our world makes it all about me, all about us. And this first page of creation helps us to stop and reflect, you know what? It's not all about us. Actually, God was doing something amazing before all of us. And we have a really important role to play. We're going to get to that. But this week, just stop and thank God for his creation. If you can, fit it into your schedule to get outdoors a couple times this week, and just to stop and reflect and thank God. Maybe say a prayer out loud of thanks and gratitude for this incredible world that God has given us. All right, I can't wait. Next week, we're going to dive into the formation and purpose of human beings in this big story that God's writing. See you next week.